My husband hit me. My parents saw the bruise, said nothing. That silence rang louder than the slap. That morning I was wiping down the kitchen counter for the third time, though it was already spotless. The rag in my hand was damp and smelled faintly of bleach. Outside, a wind stirred the red leaves across the porch, and through the foggy kitchen window I could see the sky shift toward its first hint of snow. Ethan was already at the table slurping cereal from a chipped blue bowl. He didn't look at me, just kept scraping the spoon against ceramic like he was trying to dig his way out. He said, "You always act like I'm about to say something wrong." I didn't respond, just turned my back to him and rinsed the rag. He snorted. "That attitude, always walking around here like you're made of glass." Then it happened. One quick motion. The slap wasn't loud, not theatrical. Just skin meeting skin, quick and low like a whisper you're not meant to hear. But it turned my head. And it left something behind more numb than sting. I didn't cry, I didn't speak. By the time my parents arrived, the mark had bloomed light at first like the edge of a storm cloud forming. Joan came in first, balancing a paper grocery bag against her hip. The bag crinkled loudly in the quiet. Richard followed, leaving his boots wet on the mat. My mother looked at my face. She didn't flinch. Didn't ask. Just placed the bag down on the table and said, "We brought apples. Gala, your favorite." One of them slipped out of the bag, rolled onto the floor, and came to a stop by the leg of the chair. She didn't pick it up. I stood near the sink, pulling the hood of my sweatshirt forward, careful not to touch the side of my cheek. Beneath the hoodie, the wet towel I'd tucked into the waistband of my pants had gone cold and heavy. My fingers grazed it once just to make sure I hadn't imagined what happened. Ethan reclined in the armchair like it was any other day. He didn't even mute the television. A football game was on. Some commentator's voice floated above us, loud and meaningless. Ethan didn't look away from the screen when he said, "Polite little family you've got." Joan didn't sit. Richard asked if the heat was on. I said it was. They stayed 10 minutes. Long enough to ask what we were doing for Thanksgiving. Long enough not to mention the thing they'd both seen. After they left, I stood by the sink and ran my fingers along the edge of the counter, slow and steady, like tracing something permanent. There was a candle by the window. Cinnamon spice. One I hadn't lit in years. I struck a match. Let the flame catch. I watched it burn. Then I picked up my phone and opened the message thread with Nina. Her name blinked at the top, still pinned from the last time I almost reached out. I typed, "I'm ready now." And I didn't wait for her reply. I didn't need one. I didn't gather evidence to win. I gathered it so I wouldn't forget who I was. Late at night, the house held its breath. Ethan was asleep, or pretending to be. I moved quietly, my socks catching on the old floorboard by the dresser, the one I'd meant to fix for years but never did. I pulled the bottom drawer open and reached behind the old flannel shirts I kept folded too neatly. My fingers brushed the zip case where I kept the USB drive. Black, small, password protected. I sat on the floor, knees to my chest, and plugged it into the laptop. The screen glowed against the dark. I scrolled through the folder names, each one disguised. Pantry inventory held a photo of a bruise behind my ear. Garden plan had screenshots of a $1.200 transfer Ethan made without telling me. There was a voice memo saved under July recipes. His voice, flat and irritated, said, "You always push me to this. Don't act surprised." I didn't flinch listening to it. I just watched the soundbar pulse. In another folder, paint colors, I had a scan of an ER bill from October 2019. That was the night I tripped, supposedly. The hospital staff hadn't asked much. I hadn't told much either. Back then, I thought not naming it made it less real. Now I knew better. The next morning, I met Nina at the library cafe. We hadn't seen each other in over a year, but she looked exactly the same. Dark red cardigan, calm eyes, the kind of presence that didn't ask questions right away. We both wore masks, even though the space was nearly empty. The laminated menu by the register still had sticky edges from fall specials, burnt drip coffee, pumpkin muffins that crumbled too fast. She slid a manila folder across the table. I didn't touch it yet. If you vanish, Nina said softly, this folder doesn't. We didn't hug. She just reached into her tote and placed a burner phone on the table, followed by a prepaid card for legal advice. There's a woman I trust on that hotline. Tell her my name if you need a fast response. I nodded. I don't want to be a problem, I whispered. You're not, she said. You're ready. That was when my hands shook. Just a flicker. Enough to feel it, but not enough to drop the folder. Outside, the wind bit at my cheeks as I stood in the parking lot. A low sun lit the frost on the windshield. I didn't get in the car right away. Just stood there breathing like I was trying to remember how. Back home, I waited until Ethan left for the hardware store. He thought he was fixing a doorknob that didn't turn right. He didn't know I'd loosened the screws myself. I printed one bank statement, the one with the largest withdrawal I'd flagged. I slipped it under my pillow. It felt like placing a blade I might need, but not yet. Tomorrow I leave the envelope on the table. I won't say anything. Just let it sit there like a question waiting to be read. He thought I was still folding. Still soft. Still the woman who apologized before breathing. That night I let silence hold the knife. The living room smelled like beer and stale aftershave. The glow from the television washed everything in shades of cold blue. Ethan's face, the recliner, the empty takeout boxes on the table. I moved through it like a ghost. In the mirror earlier, I dabbed concealer over my cheekbone. Just enough to blur the bruise, not erase it. I didn't want to hide, just wanted to look deliberate. I pulled on a clean shirt, dark cotton with sleeves that didn't hug too close. The kind of shirt you could walk out in and not be noticed or remembered. On the end table, I placed the envelope. Black, small. No name on it. Just paper with a voice inside. Ethan didn't stir. His eyes were half closed, a bottle resting on his stomach like a lazy badge of control. I walked into the bedroom and zipped the overnight bag, burner phone, copies of the folder, one toothbrush, no pajamas. It wasn't a suitcase, it was a step. When I came back into the living room, Ethan was sitting upright. The envelope was in his hands. He'd opened it, his brows pulled together as he read. What is this? I didn't answer. He looked at me again, this time longer. Is this a threat? Is that what we're doing now? I picked up my coat from the hook. Slipped my arms in slowly, deliberately. My hand stayed on the phone inside the pocket. My thumb hovered over the red record light. Dahlia, he said, standing now. Don't make me the bad guy. He'd said that once before. After the night, he punched the cupboard door beside my head. The one he swore was an accident. I remembered how small I felt in that moment. How I'd said I know even though I didn't. This time I didn't say anything. He stepped closer. The envelope trembled slightly in his hand. I asked you a question, he said. He reached out and grabbed my wrist, not hard, not soft. Just firm enough to make a point. That was when I held up the phone. The screen was lit. The red light blinked steadily. His face froze. Behind me a voice came from the door. Let go. This is already live. Nina's voice, calm. Icy, not loud. Ethan's fingers opened slow like something unraveling. I stepped back. He looked between us, the phone, the door, the envelope still trembling in his hand. For once he didn't speak. And for the first time I didn't blink. I didn't scream. I opened the door. The knock wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had weight behind it like the wind when it shifts just enough to signal winter's coming. Ethan had been pacing since Nina's voice cut through the hallway. You set me up, he barked. You're insane, I didn't answer. I stood by the coat rack, my hand steady on the zipper of my jacket. I'd practiced this, how not to respond to shouting. He pointed at Nina, who stood just beyond the archway, now her phone still recording. This is illegal. She's filming me in my house. Nina didn't blink. Her phone stayed level. Her posture calm. She didn't say a word. You think anyone's going to believe you, Ethan spat. You've been unstable for months. You haven't worked, haven't socialized, you barely speak. He was spiraling. I knew the signs. His voice got louder, then shrill, then soft again, almost like a plea. Dahlia. Come on. Don't do this. Just put the phone down. We can talk. That's when the second knock came. I turned the knob. Two officers stood there, one young, tall, clean-shaven, with hands tucked behind his vest. The other was older, short, gray hair, sharp eyes, calm presence. Her gaze moved from my face to the scene behind me without a word. Ethan stepped into view before I could say anything. Officers, thank God. She's been stalking me, threatening to hurt herself. I need help. The woman officer looked at him, then at me. I didn't speak. I handed her the folder I'd been holding. Thick sealed, labeled in clean, blocky black ink, emergency petition, domestic pattern evidence. She took it without hesitation. Beside me, Nina stepped forward and held out the flash drive. Everything's organized. Folder by folder, she said simply. The male officer took it, gave her a small nod. Ethan scoffed. You're believing this? This is manipulation. Look at her. She's not even upset. What kind of victim just stands there? The woman officer opened the folder and flipped through a few pages. Her eyes stopped on the third sheet. I could tell the moment she saw the photo. The bruise, the date, the physician's notes. The woman officer's voice was calm. You compiled this yourself, I nodded. Because no one else believed me until now. She didn't nod back. She just turned one more page. Then another. Behind her, Ethan's breathing turned jagged. You can't do this, he said. This is still my house. You don't get to just. She raised a hand. Sir, we're going to ask you to sit down while we review the documents. What? No, she's manipulating now, please. Her voice was firmer. Not raised. Just final. The male officer motioned toward the couch. Ethan looked at me. Not in anger, not yet. Just confusion. Like he didn't recognize the woman in front of him anymore. Like he didn't know how I'd gotten here without raising my voice. He backed toward the sofa. Saturday. The beer bottle still rested on the side table, sweating into a ring. I stepped outside. The air bit through my sleeves. Leaves clung to the sidewalk in dark clusters, wet from the afternoon drizzle. Streetlights buzzed above. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, like it was waiting for the sound that didn't come. Nina stood near the curb, hands in her coat pockets. She didn't speak. I didn't look back. Not even once. Elisa didn't ask me how I felt. She asked where the files were stored. I was sitting on my new second-hand sofa, knees tucked under a throw blanket with fading stars on it. A vanilla candle flickered on the windowsill, scent fighting against the mildew from a pipe I still hadn't fixed. The apartment was small but quiet. Mine. The laptop sat on a thrifted television tray. I clicked the link she sent. Her camera came on first. Elisa Carrington looked nothing like I imagined. Younger maybe, but with a steadiness in her eyes that aged everything she said. Behind her, book's notes taped to the wall, a half-drunk cup of what looked like black coffee. Let's start with what you've already documented, she said. I shared my screen. Folder after folder. Screenshots. PDFs. A spreadsheet Nina helped format with timestamps. Audio files with file names like Garage, July 4 and Stairs, 3 a.m. She didn't flinch. Not once. When I stopped sharing, she sat back, lips pressed. This matches what Dana gave us. Timeline overlaps almost perfectly. I blinked. Dana. Elisa nodded, turned her screen. A second woman's face joined. No makeup, hair tied back. Steady eyes. Older than me. Then a third joined. Hi, she said briskly. Alana. Alana talked fast. Like her thoughts had been waiting in line and finally spilled out. He used the same email patterns. Slight name changes. Same manipulative language and texts. You made me. Don't flip the script on me. Ringing any bells I didn't speak. Just nodded. Over and over. Elisa muted herself. Let Alana and Dana take over. Dana leaned forward. He tried to isolate me too. But mine ended before the hospital. I got out fast. Alana's voice was sharper. Mine didn't. He pulled my license through a fake report. Took 3 years to clear it. I couldn't breathe for a moment. Not from shock, just recognition. They were different women. Different towns. Different timelines. But we were telling the same story in different tenses. Here's what we're thinking, Elisa said, unmuting. One landing page. All receipts. No dramatics, no headlines. Just facts. Dana nodded. Receipts, not cries. I looked at them, 3 rectangles on a screen, and felt something shift. Not hope, not yet. But structure. We'll cross-check all 3 timelines, Alana said. Legal language, no defamation. Just proof. I opened a Word doc. Typed the first words out loud. We are not asking for justice. We are showing you the proof you chose not to see. That night, I didn't light the candle. I didn't need to. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the only light coming from my laptop screen. The final draft of the page was open. Clean layout. White background. 3 names. 3 timelines. Screenshots stacked like bricks, no commentary, no plea. Just truth arranged. Nina had offered to stay over, but I told her no. Some things you need to hit publish alone. At 11:03 p.m. I hovered over the button. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like release. I clicked once. The page went live. I didn't refresh, didn't check analytics. I closed the laptop and leaned my head back against the wall. The paint was cool. The room was still. Outside, the wind scratched at a loose screen. And I waited. At 7:12 a.m. my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. The message was short. We're reopening your case. More details to follow. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just stood up. Walked to the kitchen. Poured a glass of water with both hands steady. Some mornings don't need music to feel like victory. They just need to arrive. The courthouse wasn't grand. It looked like a DMV that had retired early. The carpet smelled like old coffee. The walls were the kind of beige that made people whisper even when they didn't need to. I stood in line behind a man arguing over a parking ticket. He held a crumpled paper in one hand and kept sighing like it was the world's fault he had to be there. I almost smiled. When it was my turn, I stepped forward. The clerk didn't look up at first. Finalization packet, she asked. Yes. My voice didn't shake. She slid a stapled document toward me. Initial here, sign there. I'll stamp and scan. Her fingernails were painted lavender. It made me like her for no reason. I signed. A stamp thunked against the page. That's it, she said. You're divorced as of this moment. No waiting period. You'll get the official decree by mail. I nodded. Thanks. She looked up for the first time and blinked. You okay? I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I am now, I said. And I meant it. I stepped outside. The sun hit different than I expected. It wasn't warm or triumphant. It was just real. I walked down the courthouse steps with my copy of the papers in a folder Nina had bought me. Blue with white flowers. The kind that don't wilt. The bus was late. I didn't mind. I stood at the corner near the courthouse, folder tucked under my arm, watching a teenager argue with her boyfriend on speakerphone. The whole street could hear. Then my phone rang. Mom, the screen read. I stared at it for a full 5 rings. Then I answered. Her voice was composed, distant in the way she always was when she didn't know how to feel something real. Hi, honey. I heard from Aunt Claire you filed today. I didn't respond. She continued. Marriage isn't perfect, you know. Your father and I, we had our years too. I watched the bus round the corner. I didn't wave it down. Neither is silence, I said. She paused. A long, heavy breath on the other end. I raised you stronger than this, she offered. Her voice cracked on stronger, like she realized too late that strength wasn't the weapon she thought it was. I didn't cry. I didn't explain. I just said I know. Then I set the phone on the bench beside me. Let her keep talking to air if she needed to. I wasn't her child in that moment. I was just a woman who stopped asking to be understood. The bus passed. I let it. I walked instead. Back at the apartment, the windows were fogged from the afternoon heat. Spring was crawling in slowly like it was asking permission. I set the folder on the coffee table and made tea even though I wouldn't drink it. The lemon balm scent reminded me of my grandmother's house. She used to say, "Let the steam do the talking when words are too sharp." I lit the small candle Nina had brought last week. Its flame was steady, unlike my hands. Then, I opened my journal. The one with pages I never used because I kept waiting for a perfect moment. The one with the stiff spine and the gold-edged paper. Today I wrote I stopped waiting for anyone else to understand. This story is mine. And I don't owe it to anyone else to make it easier to hear. I wrote slowly with a blue pen that skipped every few words. I didn't fix the ink breaks. When I was done, I closed it gently. Like tucking in a child. Then I opened the laptop. Typed in the link to the website we built. The header hadn't changed. We are the record. Under it my story sat beside Dana's and Alana's names, changed, details blurred but truths intact. I scrolled past the screenshots, the timelines, the audio clips. Down to the comment section. That's when I saw it. One message. No name. Just, I was one of his patients. Thank you. I didn't know who she was. But I felt her hand resting just beside mine on the page. I didn't reply to the message. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew she didn't need more words. She needed the silence that says, "You're not alone." I shut the laptop, turned off the lamp. The candle was still burning soft and low. I walked to the window, tea now cool beside me. I didn't pick it up. Instead, I opened the blinds just enough to see the street below. A couple walked their dog. A kid with a blue backpack ran toward a car yelling, "Mom." The world didn't know what I had done today. But I did. And I lit the candle not for them. Not for Ethan. Not even for the woman online. I lit it for me. For the girl I had been whispering into her closet years ago, terrified and invisible. For the woman who sat on courthouse steps and didn't flinch. For every version of me that survived without applause. I reached out and pressed my hand to the cold glass. My reflection looked steady. Still. Not hollow. I whispered. "You're not my shame anymore," to the bruise that was now just a faded curve beneath my cheekbone, barely there but still mine. The sky outside was softening into that kind of dusk only June knows how to hold, not quite blue, not yet black. The kind that forgives without promising anything. Somewhere downstairs, someone slammed a car door. A distant dog barked. The world kept spinning, unaware that something in me had stopped and reset. I didn't call Nina. Didn't check for updates. I just stood there breathing. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. Behind me, the tiny flame on the table held steady. Its glow caught on the journal's spine, on the empty cup, on the faint lines beneath my eyes. I thought of my mother's voice that morning. "Marriage isn't perfect," she'd said. And I, without flinching, had answered. "Neither is silence." That wasn't meant to wound her. It wasn't meant for her at all. It was for me. A kind of closing line I hadn't known I was waiting to speak. Outside, the porch light flicked on by timer. A warm, accidental gesture. But it made the candlelight behind me shimmer on the window pane, a quiet reflection of the life I now carried forward. No fanfare, no redemption arc, no performance, just breath, just dusk. And the knowing I am still here. That night, the candle on my windowsill wasn't lit for anyone else, it was for me. To remind myself that I was still here, no longer hiding, no longer asking permission to exist. Some wounds don't need to be acknowledged by others to be real. What matters more is having the courage to name them, to stop apologizing for surviving, and to reclaim the story as your own. Silence isn't always peace. It can be the longest echo of harm. If this story stirred something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts. Sometimes just knowing someone else understands is its own kind of light.